Thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon for our session on reforming SEND finance. I'm Ian Murray. I'm the Director of Public Financial Management here at CIPFA, and I'm really pleased that you've been able to join us this afternoon. This is a really important and often emotive topic, and there is a general acceptance that the reforms introduced over a decade ago by the Children and Families Act, while really well intentioned, are now not delivering the outcomes and aren't sustainable. And so there's a really clear case and a need for change. And that's one of the things that hopefully we'll cover this afternoon. I'm joined by two experts in this field. So very grateful to Emma Wilson from the National Audit Office for joining us. Emma is the Director of Education Value for Money at the NAO. And was key in authoring a report which the NAO issued in October of last year. Emma's been at the NAO for 20 years, or just over 20 years, and has significant experience auditing a range of government programmes and sectors, including detailed reviews on welfare reform, large-scale defence programmes, as well as the restoration and renewal of Parliament. So a really varied portfolio of things that she's considered in her career. I'm very grateful for Emma to join us today. And then also William Burns, who's our social care policy advisor here at CIPFA. William is our voice on social care policy and runs our social care network. His work focuses on social care reform and has produced a number of bits of thought leadership in this area, looking at things like charging reform, children's social care reform, and the National Care Service. And he was also the author of our Reforming SEND Finance report, which has been published today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand to Emma to talk us through some of the key findings from the work that the NAO did towards the end of last year. Thanks, Emma. Oh, actually, before I do that, sorry, I should have said that there is a Q&A box available, and there will be a Q&A session at the end of the proceedings this afternoon. So if you have questions, if you can put them in the Q&A box, and we'll, as they arise, but we'll deal with those in one go at the end. So yeah, over to you, Emma, and thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. So before I talk over the findings of our report from last year, looking at special educational needs, I think it's just first kind of situating the NAO. Many of you will know who we are, or perhaps have been audited by us before, but it's just useful context. So I guess helping the nation spend wisely, saving taxpayers' money, the public spending watchdog are all phrases used to coin the NAO. It's our statutory responsibility to hold central government to account for how it spends taxpayers' money, which we do through our financial audits, but also through publishing 60 value for money assessments every year on particular areas of risk and high level spend across government. We don't look at policy, but we look at how government implements that policy, and whether that's value for money. Like I said, we look at central government. We don't audit local authorities. Our remit doesn't extend that far. And hopefully through our work, we have real impact by, we publish our reports. They all have a series of recommendations which are addressed to central government departments, and we routinely follow up to ensure that the department are kind of making the changes that we suggest. So in the back of that, obviously, we do 60 reports a year. Probably about 3-4 of those are my team do across the education space. So we really need to focus on those high areas of risk. I think special educational need was a clear case for us to do a report in this area. We last reported on this in 2019, where we found the system was not sustainable, and having seen how things have gone in the last few years, it was top priority. So we published a report in October. So just flipping over to the next slide, what did we find? I think if you're used to NAO reports, our main conclusion here is actually very bold and clear, and perhaps not of a typical NAO style. But our overall finding was that the system is not delivering outcomes for children and young people. There have been increases in children with need, increases in funding which haven't kept pace with these increases in children with need. And the system isn't achieving value for money, and it's unsustainable. And I think me saying that is nothing new to you, and I think everyone recognises those challenges. and it's something probably everyone here on the call has seen, has real life experience of. But I guess the aim of our report wasn't to give those kind of that new insight, but actually to provide a real solid evidence base to help support effective decisions. Everyone knows it needs to change, and hopefully the report kind of provides that foundation. So I just want to spend the next 15 minutes or so kind of talking through our kind of recommendations, and kind of how our findings supported those recommendations, because that is really what needs to happen now in this space, which is why the CIPFA report is so important as well in terms of setting out how change can actually be achieved. So just flipping over, there's 3 areas to our recommendations that I just wanted to talk about. They can be grouped in a few ways. So first, we had a whole series of recommendations around whole system change and the need to kind of revisit how the system as a whole kind of works for children with special educational needs. The second area is around how the Department for Education builds some evidence and insights to make the best decisions it can about where to invest and where to focus its efforts. And then the last set of recommendations was about actually, making better use of the significant sums of money that is already being spent across the SEND system, as well. So I just want to pick up each of these in turn. So thinking first about those kind of system-wide recommendations, our headline conclusion in the report, hopefully something you recognise, is that the Department for Education and wider government should explicitly consider whole system reform to A, improve outcomes, and B, put the system on a financially sustainable footing. I just want to pick up a few of our findings within that to help kind of reinforce or reiterate the importance of that. So in terms of not delivering outcomes, I think everyone's kind of, heard stories and perhaps there's real life experience of this, but I think it's really important to step back and think that for the Department for Education, its primary aim of the system is to ensure that children with special educational needs have the best start in life. And actually, from what you can see here, from the data and from the chart, this is their primary measure that the department uses. And the main measure is to look at what children with special educational needs move on to do once they leave kind of schooling at age 18. Their aim is for children to move to apprenticeships or further education, or into employment. And actually, the maroon kind of line, so the proportion of children with SEND moving on to these destinations has actually stayed around 69% for the last few years, for the last 5 years, comparing that to 85% for children without special educational needs. So I think without that gap narrowing and that number staying at 69%, I think fundamentally the children with special educational needs, they're not, there is no improvement in where they're kind of what they're moving on to do. And I think that's really fundamentally important. We talk a lot about all the other kind of factors that show whether the system's working and whether it's delivering outcomes. We reference in the report the education and healthcare plans and the percentage of those that are on time, with only 50% within the statutory 12-week limit in 2023, compared to 60% being that limit for a few years previously. We also talk about the kind of appeal rates, and I'm sure we'll touch on that kind of later as well, in terms of the number of cases going to tribunal. And we also talk about kind of parent confidence in the system. All of these are indicators as to why the system is not delivering outcomes. Just flipping over to the next slide, I guess the other kind of key factor that led to us to make that kind of recommendation is around the system not being financially sustainable. And I'm sure everyone's kind of seen that, but I think just to help put your individual challenges across different local authorities into context, I just want to kind of share just some of the kind of key figures and graphics in the report. So this chart shows that since 2016-17, most local authorities have overspent their annual high needs budget. So all of those in the kind of the orange to red kind of line, above the line, have overspent, which is a lot. I mean, looking at 2022-23 alone, 101 local authorities, that's 66% overspent in that year alone. So if you take all of that together, we've talked a lot about kind of, the deficit across the high needs budget. You can see why that deficit is growing so much. And the figure we quoted in the report is that deficit is expected to reach 4.6 billion by March 2026, when the statutory override is due to end, with 43% of local authorities exceeding or close to exceeding their reserves. So just flipping over. So I mean that kind of, contributed to the conclusion that it's not sustainable. But I think it's also important to think about the future. And actually that conclusion on what is it sustainable, you need to reflect on what are those financial challenges now, looking ahead now, and also looking ahead. So again, these are some, I love charts, we love data at the NEO. These are some, we've drawn these from the reports just to help put some kind of number and flavor around kind of, I guess, what everyone's seeing in the, week by week. So the line chart that we've got, the line chart that we've got there. So just starting there, uh, this shows that actually looking ahead, the actual projected spend on Zen, the expected cost far exceeds current funding allocations. So the one maroon line is kind of funding allocations for the last few years, and we projected that going forward. So the dashed line. So that's what, based on funding, the current funding, it will look like with inflationary increases. The three lines above, that is how much the department estimates it will need to spend. And there's a big difference. So in 1 year alone, in 27-28, there's 3.4 billion gap between what their central estimate of costs and against what their funding allocation is now projected forward. So that again adds into the fact that it's not sustainable, it's not financially sustainable. The other chart, in terms of the big kind of wedge, the wedge chart, I think this shows actually, I guess the department, and as many of you know, everyone heard about kind of all the financial incentive programs, the financial support programs that the Department for Education has overseen and brought in. This shows actually those measures, have been designed for a particular purpose, but they do not touch the size when it comes to addressing the scale of financial challenge and to that local authorities face and to the time frame that they face these challenges. So this whole chart shows that actually all of these are local authorities within delivering better value or safety valve scheme. The big blue block in the middle is all of the local authorities in the delivering better value program are forecasting a cumulative deficit of 8.6 billion by the time you get to 28-29, which actually shows, I think we were really there were some positives about these schemes in terms of they are achieving some savings, but not to the scale and the level that is needed to address the financial challenges that are facing the system as a whole. I mean, take for example, just the safety valve program, as well. 28 of those agreements have target dates to eliminate the deficit after March 2026, when the deficit ends. So when the statutory override ends. So I think that just shows it's just not they're not designed. They have some success, but they're not designed to address those challenges. And we made a specific recommendation around Department for Education, working with Treasury and others, to urgently share their plans on what will happen once the statutory override ends. Just flipping over to the other kind of system-wide point that we wanted to make is that we hear a lot about the system, but it's good to kind of break down exactly what we mean by that. So I think what we find is actually we were quite positive in terms of the legislation, and the statutory code of practice actually does set out clear roles and responsibilities across different organisations and actors within the system, whether local authorities or healthcare commissions. However, despite that clarity, in practice, the system doesn't work as intended, with misaligned incentives and a lack of shared kind of prioritization, which means actually by design it doesn't work as a cohesive whole. And we made a strong recommendation around the department looking to build a more integrated system where there's those with accountability have levers to act. We drew on the example of local authorities obviously being held to account, but limited levers to feed into that recommendation. We also, as part of that, made a recommendation that's a shared understanding of the extent to which special educational needs should be prioritized alongside everything else. And there we kind of draw out the fact that special educational needs is a clear priority within local authorities and within the education space, but obviously health are a core essential partner in delivering this system. Looking at last year, they had 32 responsibilities, 32 areas on which they wanted to focus, of which SEN related to two. And actually, if you put it into context there, you can see there's not that same shared alignment of prioritization. I think that is really important to address. Moving on to the next kind of set of recommendations was around kind of building evidence of it and insights. I think this is really important because, you know, I think there will be change across the sector, and that's what everyone's pushing to afford. But I think what we really want to push for is that all of these changes are implemented in the right way and based on evidence, to actually make sure these changes deliver outcomes for children and young people. So just starting with the quote here on this side. What we found is that the department, there's had a wide range of initiatives across the SEND space. So, there's 42 ideas set out in the improvement plan, there's stuff in spending reviews and change programs. The department pulled that together into a list of 136, actions, so to speak, some quite vague, some very concrete ambitions to achieve, introduce national standards by X, Y, Z date. But it has this list and it has some good risk and governance structures. But what it didn't have was a plan to bring this all together, which is what we recommended. That a plan that would give a cost, a time frame, recognize those interdependencies, and actually make sure that all these initiatives are delivered as a cohesive whole, and recognizing the broader impact on other things, which I think is critically important. So just and obviously to be able to make those decisions on what kind of goes in the plan, you need that kind of evidence and insights and information. So I guess the first area where we drew out that need for information is on demand, which is what this, sorry, flipping back to the other slide, we'll pick that up, is on the demand for special educational needs and need support. We have the headline figure in the report. There's been 140% increase of children with education and healthcare plans in the last kind of 9 years, with all local authorities have seen increases since 2017, ranging from 0.7% in Camden to 3.7% in Liverpool. Interestingly, increases across certain needs have significantly contributed to that increase in demand. So you can see here the difference in terms of autism, and you can see the significant increase between 2015-16 and 2022-23. And we heard as part of the report various reasons for this. But what we didn't see was actually the department seeking to understand better those root causes to be able to tailor its response to address it. Whether its response is a whole system response or an educational, medical response, that was really important to know. Just flipping over to the next slide, I think the other critical thing, really important for the department and all the system to know is actually, alongside those who need support, where is their place? Where is the kind of the places to best support them? I mean, the chart here shows actually over the last few years, there's been a bit of a shift in the settings that have been used to support children with education and healthcare plans, with mainstream schools increasing from 48% to 55% of children with EHCP plans, and a fall in special schools. But I guess the real question is why? What is driving that? Is that because there's capacity constraints within special schools, or is that because, mainstream schools are better able to support these children with needs? What we found is that the Department of Education doesn't know the mainstream capacity within its schools to support children with special educational need. And without that, it's really hard to know and to break that down. If you look at special schools, you can see really why it's really important to know that data and to have that information. Department since 2023, so just a few years ago, has started to build that information. And it just shows that 63% of special schools are over capacity, supporting an additional 9,500 children, which will impact outcomes for them. But really importantly, DfE plans to increase special school places, invested in capital through the capital budget, but also through free schools. But really interesting, a lot of that funding for free schools was allocated before that data was available. So before that understanding of where there was space. And 54% of the free school budget, for example, was allocated to those with above median numbers of special school places in their local areas, which raises some interesting questions. Just flipping over then to the last couple of slides before I hand over to William. The last set of recommendations was around making better use. I talked about the 10 billion high needs budget, but actually there's so many other different funding sources and costs, across health and that feed into the system, and and actually, so there's a real question around what can be done now to make better use of that. Firstly, we made a recommendation around building that inclusive mainstream education, which I'm sure we'll touch on later. Just want to raise two quick things on that. We've talked, inclusivity is not a new thing. it was an aim back in 2014, but the department has made limited progress. And we set out in the report actually how there is no shared definition around what inclusivity actually is, and we heard a difference of views across local authorities. And there's actually no incentives to make it happen either, whether it's a financial incentive or Ofsted assessment or how the department assesses individual kind of schools. We also made a recommendation around identifying needs earlier. This chart just shows that actually, so the burgundy line at the bottom is how many children are identified under 5 are identified with special educational needs. It's tiny compared to the ages 5 to 10. Okay, it's probably not directly comparable, but there's still kind of 5-year different, covering a 5-year age span. You can see the significant thing. But what we found was there was no process or cost or method, I think, to encourage that. And then just lastly, I think we just onto the last slide. The last thing I just wanted to show is that actually, we made a recommendation around the department better sharing insights from local authorities on what works. And I think a lot of that happens anyway. But actually, we spoke to a wide range of local authorities as part of this. I think I spoke to an MJ Forum event as well, and from all of those conversations, we identified there was much appetite for much more of that. And through all of those conversations, I was able to pick up some really great ideas around how to make the system as a whole work more efficiently, effectively, which we feel brought into kind of our final recommendations, such as around kind of independent school costs and benchmarking, and formally reviewing the HCP plans as well. So that was kind of a whistle-stop tour of the NEO report. Admittedly, there's lots of kind of facts and data in there, but I really hope that gives a flavour of what we found and the challenges across the sector, and I think provides a good foundation for William's talk on kind of the future direction and what can be done about it.
Brilliantly. Excuse me. Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. That was it was a whistle stop, but some really interesting stuff in there, particularly some of the graphs and some of the charts, and actually some things that challenge maybe some of the sort of the hypotheses or anecdotal things that we hear in the sector, but absolutely quite stark as well in terms of the size and the scale of the challenges that the system is currently dealing with. So I'm going to hand to William now. He's going to talk us through the key messages from our Reforming SEND Finance report, which was released today. Just before I do that, I should have said up front that copies of both the reports and the slides from today will be sent to delegates. So if there are bits that you haven't managed to capture as we go through them, don't worry, we will send them after the session today. So over to you, William.
Thank you, Ian. So hello, everyone, and thanks for joining today. My name is William Burns, and I'm CIPFA's Social Care Policy Advisor. So today I'll speak to you about our latest report that focuses on reforming special educational needs and disabilities finance. We know that the SEND system isn't working for children and young people with SEND, as Emma has painted the picture already. His outcomes mostly haven't improved since the landmark reforms of 2014. It isn't working for parents and families who continue to have negative experiences of the system. And it isn't working for councils who are being pushed to the financial brink by ballooning deficits in the high needs block of the dedicated schools grant. Now, I won't rehearse a lot of the figures around increasing demand and expenditure, and I think Emma's done a really great job in setting the scene as well as sharing the recommendations from the NEO. And I'm sure we're all quite aware of the current situation, but I'm going to focus on the key messages from our report. So reforming SEND finance, meeting need in a sustainable system. And I think the wording of the title suggests that while we are the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, we really do not advocate reform purely based on affordability, but about ensuring that the needs of children and young people can be met within a financially sustainable system. So to start thinking about how we should reform the SEND finance system, it's helpful to set out some principles for a system that can effectively meet need and which is financially sustainable. And so this is where we begin in the report. So our principles centre on funding, early intervention, coordination between partners, market management, and financial accountability. So in the next slides, I'll go into more detail about these principles, and I'll describe how the current system fails to meet the principles and describe what a reformed system that does meet the principles looks like. So the first principle then is that funding is holistic, needs-based, and responsive to local and cohort demand and complexity. So in the current system, the funding formula is outdated. It isn't based on need, demand, or complexity. It uses historic spend, which doesn't align with today's context. Funding hasn't risen with inflation, so the £6,000 per pupil with SEND was introduced in 2013-14, and that hasn't changed since that time, which means that schools are having to do more with less. The funding for SEND is notional, meaning it has to come from within existing budgets. The statutory override has concealed financial distress. I think we'll come on and speak about the statutory override, I'm sure, at some point this afternoon. Home to school transport costs have dramatically increased, and costs for managing the system itself have increased as well. In a reformed system, what we'd like to see is that all parts of the funding system work together effectively and that we consider the funding system holistically. So that means thinking about it in its entirety rather than focusing on silos within the system, thinking about the whole system holistically. We'd like to see funding being directed towards need, demand, and complexity, and that funding could be targeted towards cohort level to meet need earlier and foster inclusion where you can. Second principle then is that spending is rebalanced towards early identification and intervention to improve outcomes using a consistent standardized outcomes framework. So in the current system, there's a lack of incentive to invest in early intervention. The threshold for statutory intervention is very low, and any kind of efforts at early intervention can be bypassed straight to the statutory end. So that is a challenge. There's no shared understanding of early intervention. It can mean different things to different stakeholders and partners. So we need a clearer shared understanding. And there isn't, a consistent shared understanding of outcomes either, of what success looks like. So, and under a reform system that does meet this principle, we'd be seeing needs being met during a transition to greater early intervention. We'd see resources shift from the statutory end of provision to prevention of escalation of need where that's possible. There'd be clarity in what successful early intervention looks like, an agreement among partners, and there'd be consistency in how outcomes are understood and measured. Our third principle is that financial resources are well coordinated between education, health, public health, and care partners. So under the current system, partner contributions can vary place to place. It can be quite ad hoc. It kind of lacks consistency across the country, which can lead to lots of time and resource being spent on negotiating who's contributing what to which package of support. And what that can lead to is timely interventions being delayed. But under a reformed system that does meet this principle, we would expect to see close partnership working between education, health, care, and other partners. We'd see the barriers towards closer funding coordination being reviewed. There'd be a clearer understanding of contributions to SEND packages, and there would be a spirit of openness and transparency in the working in the system. Our fourth principle is that the role of the independent market is reformed to reduce cost, tackle profiteering, and address inequality. So under the current system, the cost of placements can be too high. Independent assessments can drive inequalities. We're seeing in some places, it's families and parents who have resources to get independent assessments that families who don't have such resources don't have access to it, and it can actually drive inequalities in certain areas. There's conflicts of interest in some places around private assessments and provision. And there's inconsistent quality outcomes and value for money in this space. Under a reformed system, we'd expect to see consistency in cost and quality of independent provision. We'd see effective benchmarking, monitoring and evaluation to achieve better outcomes and value for money. would understand what the added value is of independent provision, and that would, inform our view of its role, and excessive profits would be curbed. And our final principle then is that financial accountability follows decision making. So under the current system, financial responsibility is unevenly apportioned between partners. Flexibility to meet need can be undermined, and there are unclear accountabilities about who is responsible for what and when. And under a reformed system, we'd see greater transparency in who's accountable for what. We'd see schools having a greater role in ensuring inclusion and being empowered to do so. We'd see the financial consequences being more evenly shared between partners. Partners would have a financial responsibility for decisions that they make, rather than it being, being experienced in different parts of the system who don't have the levers or the mechanisms to influence those decisions. And we'd expect to see a more flexible legal framework that would allow local authorities to meet need following appeals processes. So that's our principles, and kind of explains how we get from the current system. So, well, now I'm going to say how we get from that kind of current picture to the reformed picture. And we set out recommendations across the short, medium, and longer term of what we refer to as like a stabilization of a system in crisis, a transition to a renewed position, and then enshrining a sustainable SEND system. And as you can see from the key at the bottom, we give indicative financial costs ranging from, you can achieve this within the current financial envelope, to this will require significant additional investment. And we also indicate the level of legislative change that would be required. So going from, maybe you just need to change the guidance here, change that regulation. Maybe you need to change primary legislation, or new legislation would have to be introduced. So the principles that I've outlined to you, we use as a base for our recommendations. So for the first principle, our short-term recommendation is about allowing for greater flexibility within the DSG block system. So currently there's restricted movement. You can get 0.5% with agreement from the schools forum, or from a disapplication request. In some areas in the country, the DSG as a whole isn't in deficit, it's just the high needs block. That's not everywhere by any stretch of the imagination, but that will help with flexibility in that area. In the medium term, we're talking about predicating funding on the improved use of data. So we can use data, on SEND from the school census, from the schools level annual census, from general hospital school census, and from the SEND 2 data collection. Because the data is there, we're currently using an outdated funding formula. We need to be a bit more dynamic and understand that the picture's changed, and that we can direct our resources towards areas where it's most needed using the data that we have. And then in the longer term, thinking about rebalancing towards meeting cohort-based needs in mainstream settings. So what we mean by this is that schools can predict with a good amount of accuracy how many children are coming through their school that are going to have such and such need, or this special educational need. They can predict that with some level of accuracy. Now, schools should be empowered to be able to meet that need within the mainstream setting, without parents and children and young people having to go down the specialist route. We should be able to, where we can, fund schools to meet these needs at the cohort level. Moving on to the second principle then, which was about rebalancing towards early identification and intervention and improving outcomes. So in the short term, thinking about creating a shared understanding of early intervention. As I said, that's not there currently. So but if we do create this shared understanding of early intervention, then we can, it will improve collaboration, better coordinated approaches to preventing escalation of need where that is possible. In the medium term, we speak about embedding the code of practice in the legislation. So legislation and the code of practice and the reality on the ground are three distinct things that are, they're separate from one another. And in fact, the Code of Practice and the Children and Families Act conflict with each other at points. They conflict with each other in terms of graduated response, threshold for assessment around mainstream inclusion, and then it creates conflict in the system. It can create confusion in the system, and then partners are torn between the legislation and the Code of Practice. So we need to make sure that they align and that the Code of Practice is embedded in the legislation. Also, in the medium term, we speak about ensuring a pathway through early intervention. So I spoke about how the threshold for statutory intervention is low, which means that any kind of efforts at early intervention can be bypassed straight to the statutory end. So we would recommend giving children and young people, where appropriate, the opportunity to go through these kind of graduated responses before going straight to the EHCP route. And then in the long term, we speak about developing a national SEND outcomes framework. So this would provide us with clarity on the goals and benchmarks that we want to see children and young people achieving. These can be, they can cover lots of different areas. They can be academic, social, they can be about employability, well-being. There can be a number of different measures that we use there, but there needs to be a shared understanding of that. Regarding financial resources being well coordinated between partners, so in the first instance, okay, we need to support local authorities to reduce deficits. Emma's set out about the statutory override ending in March 2026. I think, it's very unlikely that the government are just going to come and wipe the slate clean, but we need the government to support local authorities to be bringing those deficits down. In the medium term, we talk about creating a principles-based national framework for education, health and care contributions. So as I said, this can vary from place to place. We understand that different areas will have different needs and different contexts, hence the principles-based nature of the framework, but there needs to be greater consistency and clarity on who contributes what when. And then in the longer term, we speak about the Department for Education breaking down the barriers to opportunity by holding the financial levers. And again, this is kind of echoing something that Emma was saying towards the end of her presentation. From a financial standpoint, the funding for special educational needs and disabilities is split between Department for Education, MHCLG, and DHSC. And each of these departments have their distinct missions and priorities, and they don't always align. So, giving one of these departments the financial levers would help improve national monitoring and decision making and help us kind of direct funding where it's most needed and improve the accountability in that space as well. Okay, on the fourth one about reforming the role of the independent sector to reduce cost and tackle profiteering. So in the immediate term, we want to develop national rate bands. Okay, local authorities can spend vastly different sums on identical provision, and it needs greater consistency. So this would remove the outliers and it would help regulate the market and curb the excessive profits being made in places. In a period of transition, we'd be looking to introduce a quality assurance framework for private advice and provision. Again, there's problems with inconsistency in quality, lack of clear benchmarks and evaluation currently with the services from the independent sector. So a quality assurance framework will give local authorities an accountability mechanism there, and it can also foster kind of continuous improvement in that space. And then finally, in the longer term, we speak about introducing a national SEND contract. There's inconsistency in how SEND is commissioned, cost of services, the evaluation, value for money. So by creating this national contract, we can create that consistency and provide assurance to system partners and providers and families. And then this is my final slide. Our fifth principle about financial accountability following decision making. In the immediate term, speaking about bringing existing partners together for earlier dispute resolution. We know that since 2013-14, there's been a 5-fold increase in appeals that are taken to a tribunal. Local authorities lose almost all of them. Okay, there's not enough being done to effectively mediate and to stop resources being directed towards that legal end of the system. We need to stop. We need to do what we can to mediate earlier and to reach resolutions before we get to that stage. In the medium term, we speak about increasing accountability for SEND in mainstream schools. The ethos of attainment in mainstream schools can work against inclusion. There's no accountability for the finance or provision of children with SEND following exclusion. And this isn't to kind of, say schools bad. This is to say that schools need to be given, the support and the power to take on that accountability and to be more inclusive, to meet needs within those mainstream settings. And then finally, in the longer term, we speak about reviewing the SEND legal framework to give local authorities greater flexibility to meet need following tribunal. So under the current existing legal framework, tribunals have far-reaching and directive powers where they can, for example, name specific provision for an individual child. That undermines local authorities' ability to meet need while considering value for money. So I think we need to kind of loosen the legal framework or change the legal framework so that local authorities have greater flexibility to meet need where they can. So thanks, Ian. That's the end of my presentation.
Brilliant, thank you, William. And again, lots of just really interesting and also challenging things for us to take in there. So we have good news is we have had some questions coming in, and please do keep them coming in. We are going to finish it at 1 o'clock, so we've got about 10, maybe 15 minutes to run through some of these questions. So there are probably more than we'll be able to answer. So let's crack on. I'm going to try and group some of them together. So there's a theme coming through the questions about the role of mainstream schools and the impact on mainstream schools. And I think they're sort of in two parts really. So do we know if there's a direct correlation between sort of the increase in mainstream school provision and schools' financial position? So lots of schools citing, SEN costs as a significant driver of budget pressures in school budgets. So how well understood is that? And and I suppose a question there about is there any evidence to suggest that actually schools are using that as a means to plug gaps in other parts of their budgets? So by facilitating either making the application or the process of getting a child being on an NEHCP easier or more difficult. So I don't know, William, if you want to go first, but just I suppose from the steering group and the work that we've done, that impact that it has on kind of individual school budgets and pressures on school would be worth exploring in a bit more detail.
Yeah. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I mean, no, I thought that was interesting from the National Audit Office report seeing the increase in children with EHCPs in mainstream settings, and that is because that is what we want to see. Really, we want more children to be in mainstream settings and fostering that inclusivity. I think I also saw somewhere in the questions and answers there was something around parental confidence around what can be met within mainstream settings, and that is it's a significant part of this. It needs to be taken into account. And this is what I was saying in the presentation and around our recommendations, that we need to be able to support schools. The government needs to be able to support schools to take on that extra accountability, because schools aren't, they're not shying away from what their responsibilities are, but they do need to be supported to take on that accountability, to meet need, to be more inclusive, and to meet cohort needs where they can. And then, that needs to be, once we kind of get to that position, that can then be communicated and to, parents and children and young people, that they can have their needs met within mainstream settings. I think there's obviously going to be cases where that won't be possible. But I think in terms of outcomes, I don't know if there's much evidence that you're going to get much better outcomes in a specialist school rather than a mainstream school in many circumstances. So that's what I would say.
So Emma, interested in your take from I suppose having looked
Mhm.
at sort of the similar question, but through the department's response and where you see sort of the DfE's role in that, and yeah, and again, any reflections from the work you've done on
Yeah.
that issue of mainstream provision.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the question in the chat around actually, it'd be really interesting to look at actually the financial impact on schools. And, as you alluded to, unfortunately, we don't have the remit to do that. But, I think there is enough evidence to show that schools are incentivized and perhaps do seek plans, etc., to help get that additional funding for schools. To the extent, we do describe that in our report as one of those kind of incentives or aspects of the design of the system that actually needs to be kind of revisited to make sure that actually the system as a whole is cohesive, and delivers value for money. So yes, I think that's definitely a very kind of live issue that needs to be looked at. I think just on that parental confidence point in kind of mainstream schools, I think that's kind of really interesting. And I think one of the questions was, how can you actually make that happen? I mean, we spoke to a lot of kind of local authorities as part of this work, as I said, and a few schools as well. And actually, one of the things that there is a lot of good practice. There is a lot of good practice out there. There are schools that are doing it really well. But I think what there isn't, and this is what the Department for Education can set out, is there isn't really a kind of clear expectation around what parents should be expecting when we talk about that inclusive education, which is where we were coming from with our recommendation that the department should set out actually what does it mean? What can parents expect from an inclusive education? Is it the curriculum? Is it the teachers, settings? What does it actually look like in practice? So once that expectation is clear, it's then about ensuring that that can be consistently provided across all schools, within different contexts.
Thanks, Emma. So I am, yeah, we've got loads of questions coming in. So I want to talk, I want to cover early intervention, and I feel it would be remiss of us not to talk about the statutory override. So let's do it in that order. So I'm gonna, Bruce has asked us a question about the role of early years and preschool provision. And I think one of the charts you shared, Emma, in your report shows that actually a lot of that need is coming in at sort of at primary school, really. So where do we see, I think, we're talking about intervention or trying to get, sort of get upstream in terms of meeting some of the need earlier so that it doesn't escalate and it isn't as acute. Do we have a sense, or do you have a sense of where those kind of key intervention points might be and what some of those interventions might look like?
So from my, I think everybody knows and everyone talks about, and there's real strong research to support the value of those kind of early kind of interventions, and that's not necessarily in that early years, but just as soon as possible. I think really interesting in our report, we only have one sentence that talks about early intervention, and that basically says the department does not have a process for how to do this. And actually, then I think our recommendation was longer than our actual finding, because there was really nothing there. So I think the kind of the real push and the real thing that has to be done is that there has to be some, I guess, some incentive or some process or some structure to encourage, schools, local authorities, everybody to start thinking about that from that kind of early age. And I think it's just funding will drive a lot of that as well. And I think we set out in the report the kind of the differences in the funding that's given to the early years sector. I think it's 3.9 billion a year is focused on the early years compared to 43 billion for kind of for 5 to 15-year-olds. So there's such a big difference, and I think that again is something that's worth looking at.
Just William, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, for me, I think, listen, obviously early intervention isn't going to work in every case, and we know that there's obviously going to be children born with kind of severe learning and physical disabilities, and that this is not going to apply for everyone. But we do also know that children are coming through the system with speech and language difficulties, with toilet training difficulties, with socialization difficulties, and so on. One of the things that we drew out in our report as well that I think is important for us to not kind of block out of our memories as well is like the kind of impact of the pandemic and the lockdowns and what the impact of that was on children and their development. And so again, I think this is when we can be looking at how can we see patterns in need and how can we be addressing them rather than individually. And how can we bring children together in these mainstream settings and meet the need that way is what I would say in terms of early intervention.
Excellent. Right, I'm really sorry because there are some really good questions here, and I'm just not going to be able to get to all of them in the time we have available. But maybe we'll take them away and we'll have a look at maybe there's something we can share with delegates after the event. So I think the final one before we wrap up then is maybe we should talk about the statutory override. And I know I have some views, but I'm going to let each of you go first. So yeah, so I don't mind who else goes. Maybe Emma. I don't know whether it's something that it's obviously something that you looked at. So I suppose the statutory override, and I suppose we're talking about transition and support to local government to reduce these deficits, but they are eye-watering, frankly. And I suppose there is this consideration at the moment about, well, should government seek to extend the statutory override, and what would that achieve? So I suppose any view that you have from the NAO based on the work that you did last year around the impact of that and the potential consequences, I suppose, if we haven't got some solutions in place by this sort of time next year, in time for this sort of time next year.
And I recognise, I think, some of the comments in the chat that this isn't just accounting. This is a very real issue, and this is money kind of being spent, and other that could have been spent on other things as well. So I think from an NAO perspective, it is not for us to tell government what to do. What is the kind of the policy solution here, whether you extend or what but what we really kind of pushed for and recommended in the report that any solution is made clear ASAP. That any solution obviously addresses the immediate challenges, but also has to be very, very fair across all of the local authorities in terms of their positions and any of the kind of the decisions that they've made, and also be really clear what is going to happen to those kind of cumulative deficits that have already been that have already built up, because there are such wider implications for the local authority financial position. I think one of the things I would mention as well is a lot of those kind of wider financial implications are being picked up by another NAO report, which will be publishing later this month, looking at the financial sustainability of local authorities, which I think many on this kind of webinar will be interested in, which actually picks up these issues in much more detail. So look out for that.
Nice plug.
I know it's seamless. I just quickly, because I know I'm aware of the time. Right. Okay. Well, what are the options regarding the statutory override? Okay, we can do nothing. I mean, okay, if we do nothing, we know from an Association of Local Authority Treasurers survey that between almost 50% of local authorities would issue Section 114 notices either immediately or in the short term. So doing nothing isn't an option. We can extend the statutory override without bringing in reform, but that's not going to fix the problem. It's just going to kick it down the road and it's going to get worse. We can say the government is going to support local authorities to bring down those deficits by the March 26 deadline. And where it can't do that, and then it only extends the statutory override until such time as those deficits can be paid off. I noticed that in the chat there's someone had said around, we've had DBV, we've had the safety valve, and that didn't work. And I think, we've seen safety valve and delivering better value work in some places and not work in other places. There are some things that did work and some things that didn't work. So what the government needs to do is look at that, evaluate that, what worked and what didn't work, and then learn from that to support local authorities to bring those deficits down. But as I think someone else had mentioned in the chat, yes, the the statutory override. It's real money that's being spent, that's being kept from the general fund, right? It's not just made up, it's not monopoly money. So what this is leading to, it's leading to local authorities having cash flow difficulties, and they can't actually be paying the bills that are coming in. They're losing interest. Well, they're paying interest on borrowing. They're losing interest on their savings. So that is also a significant problem aside from the statutory override. So the key thing is that local authorities need to be supported to bring them down through learning from what we've experienced.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think there are no perfect solutions, are there? But what's really important now is some clarity, and I think as soon as possible, really, because a number of authorities have just been through what's a really difficult budget setting round and are very acutely aware of the fact that if there isn't some form of solution this time next year, then as you say, William, there are going to be a number of councils who will effectively be in a 114 situation. I am going to wrap it up there because we have got just 4 or 5 minutes left. And I'm just going to use those minutes, first of all, to thank William and Emma for their time this afternoon and for their insight. And I really do recommend both reports, not just the CIPFA one, because they are, they're really informative read. I'd like to thank you all for your attendance and your contributions. I'm really sorry that we didn't manage to get to some of the questions. There are a number of things there that would have been great to touch on, particularly sort of other areas such as SEND transport, which I know is another huge budget pressure for local authorities. So apologies, but we will try and maybe collate those and think about what we can do with those afterwards. And then I don't know, William, if you want to do this or you're happy for me to do this, but we have a number of other events coming up in the weeks and months ahead. There's a lunchtime seminar in April, which is looking at public finance and a national care service for England and Wales. So something which may be of interest. We're also planning an event in May. We've yet to confirm the date for that, but that will look at finance business partnering in adults and children's services. And then we do a number of introduction too. So if this is something which you are interested in exploring, but it's not something that you do day to day, we run a number of sessions. They're kind of half-day sessions. We run one in the summer and one in the autumn, introducing some of the basics of what goes on in each of those services. And if you are interested in joining our social care network, then the fantastic William Burns is available to talk to you about that. So I would like to thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. I hope you've found it useful and informative. I know I have. Thank you, William. Thank you, Emma, and look forward to hopefully seeing some of you in some of our events in the not too distant future. Thank you.